It really is quite a remarkable press release, is it not? That was the first thing Sarah Ackafer said when she read it aloud in the open-plan office of Dispatch and Detail, a small investigative outlet based in a converted textile building off Farringdon Road in London. Sarah had been covering royal adjacencies, that peculiar beat where celebrity, charity, and commerce blur into something that smells like philanthropy but tastes like marketing, for 11 years. She had a gift for reading the temperature of a press release the way a baker reads dough. You press it. You wait, you see what it gives back. This one gave back very little, and that, she told her editor Marcus Webb, was precisely the problem. The release had arrived on a Thursday morning in early March, timestamped 6:00 a.m. GMT, which meant it had been engineered for the American morning news cycle as much as the British one. It bore the joint logos of a London-based footwear label called Groundwork Co. and the Archewell Foundation, the charitable organization operated by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The headline read, in the confident sans serif font of a brand that had recently hired a very expensive communications firm, Prince Harry partners with Groundwork Co. to launch veteran-designed footwear line. Proceeds to fund vocational training for former armed forces personnel. Sarah read it twice. Then she read it a third time slowly, the way you read something when you are looking not for what it says, but for what it has decided not to say. There was a shoe. This much was confirmed. A low-profile sneaker in a muted olive colorway, the color of field jackets and sandbags, and the press release was careful to note, of the British countryside that veterans return to after service. The shoe was called the Groundwork. It would retail at £145. A portion of proceeds. The release did not specify what portion would fund a vocational training program called the Craft and Service Initiative, described as a 12-week workshop series designed to give veterans hands-on skills in leather goods manufacturing, with the goal of placing graduates into employment within the footwear and textile industries. Harry's name appeared 11 times in 4 paragraphs. The veterans' names appeared 0 times. Sarah circled that. Then she picked up the phone and called Marcus. "There's a story here," she said. "The shoe," he said. "Not the shoe," she said. "The men who made it." Marcus Webb had been editing investigative pieces for 22 years, and he had a rule, which was that the most important person in any charity story is always the one who does not have a publicist. He approved Sarah's pitch in 4 minutes, which for Marcus was the equivalent of jumping out of his chair. He gave her 3 weeks, a travel budget that covered a return train to Nottingham and 2 nights in a travel lodge, and a single instruction, delivered in the tone of someone who has said this many times before. Find out whose hands are actually on the thing. The press release, to its credit, did contain one specific address. The Craft and Service Initiative workshops were being held at a facility called Marston Yard, a repurposed Victorian hosiery factory on the eastern edge of Nottingham's Lace Market district. The building had been taken on by a charitable trust 3 years earlier and converted, floor by floor, into a hub for skilled trades training. On the ground floor, woodworking. On the second floor, metalwork. On the third floor, which smelled of hide and beeswax and something older than either, leather. Sarah booked her train for the following Monday. Before she left, she did what she always did before any reporting trip, which was to spend a full day doing nothing but reading. She read everything Groundwork Co. had published publicly. Their brand story, their sustainability reports, their Instagram captions going back 3 years. She read everything Archewell had said about veteran welfare. She read the Ministry of Defense's most recent report on veteran employment outcomes, which was dense and bureaucratic and genuinely distressing in the way that government documents about suffering always are. The suffering rendered in percentages and cohort data and fiscal year projections, until it no longer looked like suffering at all. She read one more thing. A short profile, published 8 months earlier in a Nottingham local paper, about a man named David Forsyth who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Royal Engineers, come home with a back injury and a sleep disorder that no one had quite managed to name, worked 3 warehouse jobs in 4 years, and then, on the advice of a veteran support worker, walked through the doors of Marston Yard on a Tuesday morning in November, carrying a packed lunch he hadn't needed to bring because lunch was provided. The profile was 300 words long. It had been read, according to the paper's public engagement counter, 214 times. The Groundwork Co. press release, by the time Sarah closed her laptop that evening, had been picked up by 47 international outlets. She wrote David Forsyth's name at the top of a new page in her notebook and underlined it twice. The Groundwork Co. offices occupied the top 2 floors of a glass and reclaimed brick building in Shoreditch, which is the part of East London that has been described as up and coming for so long that the phrase has lost all geographical meaning and now simply means expensive. The reception area featured a wall of raw concrete, 3 hanging plants, and a display case containing the brand's archive of previous releases, clean, minimal shoes in earthy tones, each accompanied by a small card explaining the material provenance: Ethiopian leather, Portuguese cork, Welsh wool. Groundwork Co. had built its identity on the idea that a shoe could be a moral object, which was either a genuinely interesting proposition or a very sophisticated marketing strategy. And Sarah had spent enough time in journalism to know that these 2 things were not mutually exclusive. She had been granted a 30-minute interview with the brand's head of partnerships, a man named Theo Callahan, who was 34, wore a linen shirt the color of oatmeal, and had the particular energy of someone who had recently completed a leadership course and was still processing the experience. Theo was generous with words and careful with specifics. He spoke warmly about Groundwork Co.'s commitment to impact-driven design. He used the phrase authentic storytelling 4 times in 20 minutes, which Sarah noted without comment. He showed her the mood board for the Groundwork shoe, a large printed sheet pinned to a corkboard, featuring images of Salisbury Plain, leatherworking tools, close-up photographs of stitched boot seams, and a single black and white portrait of a man in a workshop whose face was turned partly away from the camera. "Who's that?" Sarah asked. Theo looked at the board. "That's one of the workshop participants," he said. "Great image, right? The photographer caught something really real there." "Do you know his name?" A brief pause. "I'd have to check with the comms team," Theo said. "We have all the releases signed, obviously." Sarah wrote something in her notebook. Theo tried to read it upside down but couldn't. The 30 minutes became 40 because Sarah asked good questions and Theo, to his credit, was not a bad person. He was a person operating inside a system that had decided the most important variable in a charitable partnership was reach, and reach was measured in headline pickups and influencer shares, and the number of times a royal name appeared in a press release. He genuinely believed the craft and service initiative was valuable. He had visited Marston Yard once in January for what the brand called a site orientation, and he had been moved by what he saw there. He just hadn't asked anyone's name. When Sarah left the building, she stood on the pavement for a moment and looked up at the sky, which was the flat white of a London afternoon in March. And then she walked to the tube station and took the Victoria line to King's Cross and caught the 14:03 to Nottingham and arrived at Marston Yard at 4:30, when the light through the factory's tall Victorian windows was the color of old brass. And the 3rd floor smelled of hide and beeswax, and something that took her a moment to identify and then did. It was concentration. The particular atmospheric quality of a room full of people learning something difficult and refusing to stop. The 3rd floor of Marston Yard was not large. It held 8 workbenches, each equipped with a cutting mat, a set of leather knives and all, a bone folder, and a wooden lasted form around which the components of a shoe could be assembled. At 5 of the benches, men sat working. Their ages ranged. Sarah estimated from late 20s to early 50s. They did not look up when she came in. This was not rudeness, it was focus. Leather does not wait for social niceties. If your cut drifts, the piece is ruined. The workshop was run by a woman named Philippa Crane, who was 51, had trained as a cordwainer, a maker of new shoes, as distinct from a cobbler who repairs them, at the Cordwainers College in London in her mid-20s, and had spent the subsequent 2.5 decades doing everything from making bespoke riding boots for a firm in Northamptonshire to teaching Saturday morning craft workshops at a community center in Derby. She had a short gray ponytail, paint-stained fingers that she explained were actually dye-stained, and the unhurried authority of someone who has spent decades teaching people to do something precise with their hands. She had been running the Craft and Service initiative for 14 months. The partnership with Groundwork Co. was 8 weeks old. When Sarah asked her how she felt about the partnership, Philippa was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing accuracy over diplomacy. "It's useful," she said finally. "The funding is real, the training budget is real, the machine time and the materials all real. The men get to work on an actual product that will actually be sold. That matters. It's different from a practice exercise. They know it counts." "And the other parts?" Sarah asked. Philippa looked at the workbenches. "The other parts," she said, "I try not to think about too much. I have a workshop to run." Sarah liked Philippa Crane very much. David Forsyth was 43 years old and had the hands of a man 20 years older, which he explained without self-pity was what 2 tours with the Royal Engineers and a decade of warehouse work did to a person. He was broad across the shoulders and quiet in the manner of someone who has learned that speaking costs something and has therefore decided to spend carefully. He had been coming to Marston Yard for 6 months before the Groundwork Co. partnership began, which meant he had already learned the basic vocabulary of the craft. How to skive a leather edge to thinness without cutting through it, how to read the grain of a hide, how to punch a clean stitch line, before anyone with a press release got involved. He told Sarah about this over tea in the small kitchen adjacent to the workshop, on the first of 3 mornings she spent at Marston Yard. He held the mug with both hands, the way people do when they are cold, or when they simply need something solid to hold. "The thing about this," he said, meaning the leather work, the cutting, the assembly, the whole slow craft of making a shoe, is that it doesn't care who you were. The material doesn't know your rank. It doesn't know your medical history. It just responds. You treat it right, it behaves. You rush it, it tells you." He paused. Outside the window, a pigeon landed on the sill and then immediately left, as if it had come to the wrong address. "I spent a lot of years," David said, "being in places where things didn't respond to how you treated them, where you could do everything right and it still went wrong. This is different. This is honest." Sarah asked him how he felt about the shoe being linked to Harry's name in the press coverage. David Forsyth looked at his tea. He was quiet for long enough that Sarah began to think he wasn't going to answer, and then he said, "I don't think about it much. I hope it sells. I hope the money does what they say it'll do. Harry, look," he served. "He knows what it is to be in a uniform and not quite know what you are when you take it off. I don't hold anything against him. He stopped. "Just what?" Sarah said. "I just hope someone remembers that there were hands on that shoe before the photographs happened." The second veteran Sarah spoke to at length was a man named Tony Reeves, who was 31 and had served 4 years with the Parachute Regiment, including a 7-month deployment to Mali, and had come home to find that the particular skills he had accumulated, navigation, ordnance recognition, the ability to function on 4 hours of sleep in temperatures that would stop most machinery, translated to exactly nothing in the civilian employment market, which was not something anyone had warned him about, and which he described, without drama, as a fairly significant surprise. Tony was the most technically advanced student in the workshop. Philippa had said this before Sarah met him, and watching him work made it immediately obvious. His cuts were clean and decisive. His stitch lines were straight. He had the spatial intelligence of someone who could see, before assembly, how the flat components of a shoe would fold into 3 dimensions. He was also, Sarah noted, wearing a pair of heavily worn brown work boots that had been resoled at least twice and repaired across the toe box with what appeared to be contact adhesive and considerable ingenuity. She asked him about the boots. He looked down at them. "These are good boots," he said, with a completeness that suggested the subject was settled. Tony's view of the Groundwork Co-partnership was pragmatic to the point of being almost architectural in its structure. He had heard about Prince Harry's involvement. He had read the press release, or rather, he said, he had read the first paragraph of the press release and then stopped because the second paragraph had the phrase "authentic storytelling" in it, and he had a rule about phrases like that. He was not hostile to the partnership. He was not particularly moved by it. What he was, he said, was employed, or rather, almost employed, which was further than he had been in 2 years. "There's a firm in Leicester," he said. "Small place. They make welted shoes for the mid-market. Philippa knows the owner. He's coming to see our work at the end of the program. If he likes what he sees," Tony shrugged, the gesture of a man who has learned not to complete sentences about the future because the future has previously demonstrated a reluctance to cooperate. "We'll see." Sarah wrote, "He's wearing boots, not sneakers." Then she underlined it. The third man whose story Sarah spent time with was older than the others. His name was Raymond Osai. He was 54, and he had served 17 years in the Army Catering Corps before a knee injury ended his service, and a divorce ended his marriage, and a housing crisis ended what had remained of the infrastructure of his life in close enough succession that he had, for approximately 18 months, been without a fixed address. He spoke about this with a precision and a lack of sentimentality that Sarah found both admirable and slightly heartbreaking. The way a person speaks about a difficult period when they have done enough work on themselves to see it clearly without being destroyed by the view. Raymond had come to Marston Yard not through a veteran support worker, but through a man he had met at a food bank, who had mentioned the workshops in passing. The way people mention things they think are probably too good for your current circumstances, but feel they should say anyway. Raymond had written the address on his hand, gone home. To the supported housing unit he had by then secured, looked it up online, and appeared at Marston Yard the following week without having told anyone he was coming, because he did not want to be redirected or assessed or processed. He wanted to see for himself if the thing was real. Philippa had let him in and shown him to a bench and handed him a piece of leather and a knife and said, "Let's see how you hold a blade." And Raymond had held it, and it had been fine. And he had come back the next week, and the week after that, and now here he was, 14 months later, cutting the upper panels of a shoe that would have Prince Harry's Foundation's logo on the box it shipped in. And he was not sure how he felt about that, but he was sure about the leather. The leather, he said, was straightforward. The leather was real. Raymond's skill, it emerged, was not in cutting or stitching, both of which he did competently, but in finishing. The final stage of shoemaking, which most people never think about, involves the careful application of edge dressings, polishes, and burnishing treatments that give a shoe its particular surface personality. Raymond had a gift for this. Philippa had identified it early and encouraged it, and Raymond had leaned into it with the focused gratitude of someone who has discovered, later than expected, that they are good at something worth being good at. He showed Sarah a pair of Groundwork sneakers he had finished the previous day. He placed them on the bench between them, and she looked at them, their muted olive surface, their clean white sole edge, their small brass eyelet rings, and she saw, suddenly, that they were genuinely beautiful, not in the way of expensive things that announce their expense, in the way of things that have been attended to. "You did that," she said. "I did that," Raymond said, with a quietness that was the opposite of boasting. The visit was announced on a Wednesday for a Friday, which gave Marston Yard approximately 36 hours to be informed, prepare, receive a security briefing, be informed again, prepare again, receive a follow-up security briefing, and then be told that everything would be perfectly fine and natural, and that the visit was simply an opportunity for the Duke to connect with the program in an authentic and meaningful way. Which was the kind of sentence that sounds reassuring until you notice that it contains the word authentic and reminds you of Theo Callahan's mood board. Philippa Crane received the news with the expression of someone who has been asked to move their furniture so that a photograph can be taken of their living room. She moved the furniture. She did not, however, move the benches. The benches stayed where they always were, because the light from the tall windows fell on them exactly right for working, and she was not going to rearrange her workshop for a photograph. On the Friday morning, Sarah arrived at Marston Yard at 7:30, which was an hour and a half before the royal party was due and 2 hours before the press pool was scheduled to enter. She found David, Tony, and Raymond already at their benches, already working. She asked David if he was nervous. "About what?" he said, not unkindly, and returned to his cutting. The press arrived before Harry did, which is always the case and always feels slightly absurd. A dozen photographers and camera operators arranging themselves around a space before the thing they are there to photograph has happened, like stagehands setting lights for a play whose script they haven't read. They were professional and practiced, and they moved through the workshop with the efficiency of people who have done this in many rooms for many events, and they set up along the south wall, lenses pointed toward the door, and they waited. Harry arrived at 9:45. He came in without the kind of entrance that announces itself, no music, no particular shift in the room's energy that Sarah could pinpoint in advance. He was simply not there, and then he was. He was wearing dark trousers and a plain navy jacket over a gray shirt, no tie, no cufflinks that Sarah could see. He was accompanied by 2 members of his foundation team, a liaison from Groundwork Co., and 2 protection officers who positioned themselves with the practiced invisibility of people whose job is to be present without being noticed. He shook hands with Philippa first, which Sarah noted, not with Theo, who was also present, with Philippa. Philippa introduced him to the workshop, the benches, the tools, the process, in the same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of someone who assumes competence in her audience and proceeds accordingly. Harry listened. Sarah, watching from the north wall, noted that he asked questions in the manner of someone who wants to know the answer, which is different from the manner of someone who wants to be seen asking. He asked about the lasted form. He asked about the skiving process. He picked up an awl and held it for a moment, testing its balance. Then Philippa took him to the benches and introduced him to David, and then to Tony, and then to Raymond. The photographers worked steadily through all of this. Frames of Harry listening, frames of Harry at the bench, a frame of Harry holding a cut leather piece, his head bent toward it with what appeared to be genuine attention. These would be the photographs that appeared in the coverage, in the Times, in the Daily Mail, in outlets across the United States and Australia and Canada. Photographs of a prince in a workshop, learning the shape of a shoe. They were good photographs. They were true photographs in the sense that the events depicted had occurred. They were also, in the way of all photographs, a selection, a chosen rectangle of a much larger room. What the photographs did not show was what happened at 11:15, when the official visit had concluded, and the press pool had been escorted out, and the Groundwork Co. liaison had gone downstairs to take a call, and the 2 foundation staff members were in the corridor checking schedules, and Harry remained at Raymond's bench, looking at the pair of finished sneakers Raymond had placed there that morning. Sarah was still in the room. She had positioned herself quietly, and the moment had settled around her the way moments do when the performed part of a day is over, and what remains is just people. Harry picked up one of the sneakers. He turned it in his hands. He looked at the edge finishing, Raymond's particular gift, The careful burnished seam where the sole met the upper. The clean, dressed edge that most people who wore the shoe would never think to examine. "You did this," he said to Raymond. "I did that," Raymond said. He said it the same way he had said it to Sarah, with the quietness that was the opposite of boasting. Harry set the shoe down. He looked at it for another moment. Then he said something that Sarah nearly missed because one of the protection officers shifted position slightly, and the sound of shoe leather on the wooden floor overlapped with the words. But she caught it. She wrote it in her notebook immediately, in the present tense, the way you write something you want to keep accurate. He says, "I spent a long time thinking the uniform was the thing. It took me a while to understand that it was never the uniform. It was just the people in it." Raymond nodded. He did not say anything. He picked up his burnishing tool and returned to the shoe he was finishing, because there was work to be done and the leather did not wait. Harry stayed for another 20 minutes, talking quietly with each of the men at the benches. Not in the way of a royal visit with its choreographed movement from station to station. In the way of someone who has time and is choosing to spend it here. When he left, he shook hands with each of them, and with Philippa, and then he was gone, and the workshop was quiet for a moment. And then David picked up his knife, and Tony picked up his awl, and Raymond kept burnishing, and the room returned to itself. The groundwork sneaker launched on a Tuesday morning in April, at 9 o'clock GMT, which was timed for the European morning and the American overnight cycle. The product page went live simultaneously on the Groundwork Co. website and on a dedicated landing page maintained by the Archewell Foundation. The page featured the olive colorway, the only colorway, at £145 per pair, with a note specifying that 30% of each sale would be directed to the Craft and Service Initiatives Training Fund. 30% was more than Sarah had expected. She wrote it down. The shoe sold out in 41 hours, not 41. The restock, announced 3 days later, sold out in a day and a half. Groundwork Co. declined to release total sales figures publicly, but a source familiar with the brand's operations told Sarah, off the record, that the initial run had been 3,000 pairs and the restock was 1,500. At £145 per pair, with 30% directed to the fund, this represented a training budget contribution of approximately £190,000 across the two runs. £190,000 directed to a workshop in a converted Victorian hosiery factory on the eastern edge of Nottingham's Lace Market would fund approximately 4 years of full program delivery at current operating costs. Philippa Crane, when Sarah told her the number, was quiet for a moment. "That's real," Philippa said. "Yes," Sarah said. "Right then," Philippa said, and went back to the workshop. The coverage of the launch was what Sarah had expected it to be. Harry's name in the headlines. Harry's foundation in the subheadings. Photographs of the shoe against a neutral background and of Harry in the workshop, the leather piece in his hands, his head bent with attention. The word veteran appeared frequently, usually as an adjective, veteran designed, veteran made, veteran supported, and always in proximity to Harry's name, as though the veterans were an attribute of the project rather than its substance. 3 outlets ran the photographs of Harry at Raymond's bench, none of them named Raymond. Sarah's piece ran on the Thursday after the launch, in dispatch and detail, and in 2 partner publications that had picked it up after Marcus sent it round. It was 4,000 words, which is long for digital journalism in the current climate. And Marcus had argued briefly for cuts before reading it again and deciding against. The headline, which Sarah wrote herself, was, "The shoe sold out in 41 hours. Here are the men who made it." The piece opened with David Forsyth's hands. It moved through Tony's boots. It arrived at Raymond's finishing bench and the pair of sneakers placed there on a Friday morning. And the moment, which Sarah described with the restraint of a writer who knows that understatement is the highest form of emphasis. When a man who had once commanded armies in his professional life stood at a workbench in Nottingham and told another man that what he had made was worth looking at. It named them all: David Forsyth, Tony Reeves, Raymond Osite, Philippa Crane. It named the factory and the trust that ran it and the support worker who had first mentioned Marston Yard to David in a hospital corridor 3 years earlier, whose name was Janet Birch and who had been doing her job quietly and without recognition for 17 years and who, when Sarah called her, said only, "Oh, are you doing a piece on the lads? How are they getting on?" The piece did not condemn Groundwork Co. or the Arch-UL Foundation. It was not that kind of piece. It noted accurately that the funding was real and the training was real, and the 30% was more than many comparable partnerships offered. It noted, equally accurately, that of the 11 times Harry's name appeared in the original press release, the veterans' names appeared 0 times, and it invited the reader to sit with that arithmetic for a moment. The piece was read in its first week by approximately 80,000 people. This is not a large number by the metrics of viral content. It is a very large number by the metrics of long-form journalism about people the internet has not yet decided to care about. The Leicester firm visited Marston Yard 3 weeks after the launch. The owner's name was Graham Heathcote, and he had been making welted shoes in the same building on the same street in Leicester for 29 years, and he came to the workshop on a Wednesday afternoon and walked the benches slowly and looked at the work and asked questions about technique, about consistency, about what each person could do and how long it had taken them to get there. He offered Tony a position the following week, a junior maker's role, entry-level, full-time, at a wage that was not spectacular but was honest and came with the possibility of becoming something more. Tony, when Sarah called him with the news that she had heard from Philippa, said, "Yeah, I know, I start Monday." And then, because Tony Reeves was a person who communicated in facts rather than feelings but occasionally allowed the two to briefly coincide, "It's a real job, making real shoes. It's good." He was wearing the brown boots on his first day. Philippa had told Sarah this. She had seen him leave Marston Yard for the last time as a student, at the end of his final session, and he had been wearing the brown boots, resoled twice, repaired across the toe box with contact adhesive and ingenuity. And she had said nothing about this because she understood, without needing to discuss it, that a man who keeps a good pair of boots going through 4 years of difficulty knows something about the value of things that last. David Forsyth did not get a job offer from a Leicester shoe firm. What he got was different and, Sarah thought, in some ways more significant, though she was aware that significance is not a currency that pays rent. He became Philippa's assistant instructor on the new cohort of the Craft and Service Initiative, which began in May with 6 new participants, all veterans, all at different stages of whatever it is veterans are at stages of when they walk through the door of a workshop on a Tuesday morning, carrying a packed lunch they didn't need to bring. His role was part-time, paid at a modest hourly rate drawn from the training fund, and it involved doing what Philippa did, standing at someone's shoulder, watching their hands, knowing when to speak and when to wait. He was, Philippa told Sarah, very good at the waiting part. David himself, when Sarah called to tell him she was writing a follow-up note for the piece, said, "You can say I'm working. That's the main thing. You can just say I'm working." Sarah said she would say that. She said it. Raymond Ose was the last of the 3 she spoke to, because Raymond was harder to reach, not evasive, simply busy, which is a thing you forget can apply to a person until it applies again, and you remember that it is the ordinary texture of a life that is going somewhere. He had been approached through Philippa by a small accessories brand in Sheffield that made leather goods, wallets, card holders, belts, small bags, and was looking for a finisher, someone who could take a piece of work at its penultimate stage and bring it to the surface quality that made it worth what it cost, someone with an eye for the last 2% of a thing, which is where most of the value lives. Raymond had gone to Sheffield for a trial day. He had finished 3 pieces while the brand's founder watched. The founder, a woman named Carla Mensa, who had started the brand from her kitchen table and built it into something that stocked in 4 independent retailers across the north of England, had offered him a part-time trial contract on the spot. Raymond told Sarah this on the phone on a Tuesday evening in late May. He was, he said, going to take it. He had thought about it carefully, the travel, the hours, the uncertainty of a trial contract, and he had decided that it was real work and real leather and a real chance, and that these 3 things together were worth the risk of the 4th thing, which was the possibility that it might not work out. Sarah asked if she could include this in the follow-up note. Raymond said yes. Then he said, "Make sure you spell my name right." She did. The Groundwork sneaker, in the months following its launch, accrued the secondary life that successful limited edition products accrue: resale listings at £210, collector forum discussions about the construction quality, a feature in a sneaker culture magazine that described the shoe as quietly exceptional, and spent 3 paragraphs on the edge finishing, nodding without knowing the full story. That it had a human quality to it that was difficult to articulate but immediately apparent to anyone who picked the shoe up and turned it in their hands. The writer did not know whose hands had been on the shoe, but the hands had left something there regardless, the way hands always do on things that have been made with attention. Sarah Okafor filed her follow-up note in June. It was shorter than the original piece, 800 words, a brief accounting of where the 3 men had gone. Marcus ran it without cuts. The headline was, "An update on the men the headlines forgot. They're working." It was read by 40,000 people, which was half the original piece. This is how journalism works. The update is always less than the announcement, the consequence always less visible than the event. Sarah understood this and had made her peace with it years ago. You write the thing, you name the names, you spell them right. The rest is not in your hands. Coda, the most important person in the room. There is a version of this story in which Prince Harry is the protagonist. In that version, a man who has struggled publicly with the weight of his own name uses that name to do something useful, attaches it to a program that needs visibility, lends it to a shoe that funds 4 years of training, and then shows up to a workshop in Nottingham and listens, actually listens, to the men whose hands have been on the work. That version is not wrong, it is just incomplete. There is another version in which Philippa Crane is the protagonist. In that version, a woman who has spent 25 years teaching people to make things with their hands creates a space in which 3 men, each carrying a different weight, each arriving at a different stage of their particular difficulty, find, in the slow and honest language of leather, a way back into a life that will hold them. That version is also not wrong, it is closer. But the version that Sarah Okafor believed, sitting on the train back from Nottingham on the last of her 3 visits, watching the Midlands landscape flatten into the outskirts of London, the warehouses and light industrial units and the backs of houses with their small enclosed gardens, is the version in which no single person is the protagonist, because the thing that happened at Marston Yard was not the story of one person, it was the story of a room. A room with tall Victorian windows and the smell of hide and beeswax and concentration, and 8 benches, and hands-on leather. And a woman who knew when to speak and when to wait, and 3 men who showed up on Tuesday mornings when they didn't have to, and kept showing up, because the material was honest and the work was real and the shoe, when it was finished, was worth looking at. Harry understood this, Sarah thought. He had said so in his way, standing at Raymond's bench with the finished sneaker in his hands. He had understood that the uniform was never the thing, that it was always the people. The most powerful thing a prince can do, in a room full of people who have already proven they can do without one, is to put down the shoe, shake their hands, and get out of the way. He did that. The men kept working,